Hello, my name is Rain, and welcome to my channel where I discuss Fantasy Formula 1. Fantasy Formula 1 in 2025. We're here, it's been some time, but the channel is back up and running. I can't wait to get going with the new season, but it's still some time away. In fact, it's 2 months away, and I really don't have any information. But that's what I thought would be fun to do, is to actually try and predict the prices for the F1 Fantasy 2025 season, really before we know anything. A lot of things could change about F1 Fantasy. A lot of things could change about the game. We did this entire survey and gave all that information to the F1 Fantasy team at the end of last year. So we don't really know what's changing and what's staying the same about the game. A lot of things could change, but assuming everything stays the same about the game, these will be my predictions, and then it could be fun to look back at these predictions when the prices drop in end of February, maybe, to see if we got them right or not. This is, again, before any information about performance of the car comes out. I have no idea who's going to be good. Perhaps Sauber could do a Haas and be the 6th fastest team. I don't know. I doubt it, but again, I have no idea. I've only seen Lewis Hamilton in a Ferrari this year. That's the only Formula 1 I've seen, and that was pretty good. That was pretty good, right? And also, all these predictions are made by an idiot with a mic and a camera. So if you disagree with me, please let me know down in the comments. If you haven't already, while you're down there, you might as well subscribe so that you can tell me later how wrong I was and how right you were. And also, a lot of fun things are coming to this channel. As soon as some more information about the game starts dropping, I will be making detailed guides about the game, what to do, what not to do. And of course, I will be ready with my team selections and all of that good stuff once we start getting into March and gearing up for Australia. So here, without further ado, are my price predictions for F1 Fantasy 2025. Let's just get right into it. Right, so first up, let's start with a rookie from the lowest placed team in the Constructors last year, and let's just work our way up through the Constructors field. And let's start with Bortoleto. Now, it's pretty hard to predict rookies, right, because we don't know really anything about their driving ability in F1. Perhaps Bortoleto is the GOAT. We don't know yet. But I only have some other factors to go by, and that's what I've put on the screen here. So Bottas, who was the lowest priced driver at Sauber last year, was 6.4 million. And Sargent, which was the lowest priced asset in the game, was 5.5 million. Now, I think Bortoleto is going to come in lower than what Sargent was priced, because remember, Sargent was still driving for a Williams, which we assumed would be quite good, perhaps even a P8, P7 type good, and Sargent was still only 5.5 million after the disappointing 2023 season. Now, this is no dig at Bortoleto's driving ability. I'm not saying he's worse than Sargent or that he's better than Sargent. Sorry, Sargent fans. But I do think he's going to be 5.2 million for the simple reason that Sauber are bad. And I don't think they're going to do a Haas. Last year, everyone assumed Haas would be the worst team by far, but they weren't. Sauber was the worst, but with their new Audi ownership in 2026, I don't see them spending money on this year's development. We have new regulations in 2026, and I do think Audi will want to get off with a bang. So why spend money this year at all, really? For that reason, I do think Bortoleto, being new to the sport as well, alongside such a well-rounded and just really, really good midfield driver in Nico Hulkenberg, and after the season that Nico had last year, I think Bortoleto will be quite much lower than him and come in at 5.2 million as the cheapest asset in the game. And if he does come in at 5.2 million, could be a fantastic option if he does what Show did last year, qualifying last and then maybe climbing a few positions in the race, just getting a solid 5-6 pointer every race, slowly, steadily rising in price. So I think Bortoleto at 5.2 million would be a steal, but I do think there is a possibility that F1 Fantasy could price him that low, even lower than what Sargent started the game as. We get to Hulkenberg. Now, Hulkenberg was 6.4 million at the start of the game, driving for Haas, obviously. Show, who was the highest priced driver in Sauber last year, was 6.6 million. And Hulkenberg in Haas ended the 2024 season at 11.8 million, a meteoric rise in price. Magnussen was crazier, but Hulkenberg's is still pretty crazy. 11.8 million is a very, very big jump for someone who started as the second or third cheapest asset in the game, equal to Bottas, only ahead of Magnussen and Sargent. For that reason, I do think he will be overpriced. I think Hulkenberg will be the Bottas equivalent of this year, someone who we all know is a good driver, but he just will not perform F1 fantasy-wise because the car he's driving is that bad. I think he will consistently outperform the car in qualifying, meaning he will get... I wouldn't be surprised if Hulkenberg dragged that Kick Sauber to a Q3 finish a couple times this season. You know, not every weekend like he did in the Haas, but a few times. And I think that's ultimately going to be bad for his F1 fantasy value. I still think that F1 Fantasy will overprice him at 7.0 million, slightly higher than what show was for Kick Sauber. And I think Hulkenberg at this price, especially compared to Bortoleto, will be a bad option to buy. I think he'll be this classic noob trap, if you will. People who haven't really played the game before, they knew how good Hulkenberg was last year. They're like, oh my god, he's only 7 million, and they'll buy him, not realizing that Bortoleto at 5.2 will be a much, much better option. So I think Hulkenberg will be overpriced. I think he'll be more expensive than what show was at the start of the season, even though he's driving for a worse car than what we expected the Sauber to be at the beginning of last year, just based on what he did in Haas last year. So I think Hulkenberg will come in at 7.0 million. Next up, we have Alex Albon. Alex Albon driving for Williams. Williams came P9 quite disappointingly for them in the Constructors' Championship. Albon started last year at 7.0 million in a Williams that was expected to be, you know, 9th or 8th place in the Constructors' Championship. And Albon came into the 2024 season with some good performances behind him. But ultimately, he ended up only going up to 8.6 million in 2024, mainly due to just the amount of DNFs that he had, especially towards the tail end of the season. With that said, though, I do think Albon will stay at 7.0 million. The reason for that being is that I do think he was pretty well priced last year. Someone like Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hulkenberg were obviously very, very underpriced comparing to how they performed. Albon, I think, was correctly priced. And this year, I'm expecting Williams to once again be that P8, P9 kind of team. Maybe bring it to Haas in terms of their development, if they end up not crashing the car every other race. So with that said, I think Albon at 7 million would be a good, you know, a decent purchase. Definitely better value than Nico Hulkenberg, but I do think they will stick him still at 7.0 million. I feel like that's the correct pricing for Alex Albon. And then moving over to his teammate, Carlos Sainz. Again, don't have an image of him in a Williams kit, but that's okay. Sainz is also a difficult one to predict because obviously he was at Ferrari. Ferrari versus Williams, very, very different teams. He was 18.5 million at Ferrari. I put Albon's price here at 7.0 million at the start of last year again. And, I mean, Sainz ended the season at 24.4 million after a couple of wins, but I don't really think that is too... You know, they can't really look at that. They have to kind of look at Albon's performances while still, you know, taking into account that Sainz should be the better driver. And I think similarly to Hulkenberg, they will overprice him because of that. They will overprice him due to the performances last year, the potential gain that Williams could make this season, maybe climbing up to the P7 place in the Constructors. And I think he'll be overpriced at 9.5 million. I do think Albon is a better option than Sainz at that price. But then again, if Sainz comes in and is just way better than Albon, 9.5 is not bad. Like, let's remember someone like a Yuki Tsunoda, perhaps, who started the year, and we're getting to him in a moment, but Yuki Tsunoda started the year at 8 million, climbed up to about 12 million. In Ricciardo's case, he was 9 million and ended up similarly priced, but obviously there were driver changes there. So 9.5 million is what I think they'll price Sainz at, which I think is slightly too expensive. But then again, as long as, you know, the price change algorithm stays the same, anything under 15 million could end up gaining in price. And the combination of Sainz with some other drivers, maybe if you had money to spend, could be worth going for a Sainz. I don't think he's going to be as bad of an option as Hulkenberg is. I think Hulkenberg is really going to be the noob trap of this year. But I do think Sainz will be quite overpriced compared to Alex Albon. All right, then we have another rookie in Isaac Hadjar. Now, last year, VCARB was predicted to be that, top 6 team, maybe pushing for top 5. So they were priced pretty highly at 9 million and 8 million, Ricciardo and Tsunoda. I thought last year the Tsunoda was just way better because of his price. Ended up being the case both on and off track. Now, Hadjar, rookie, don't know much about him. I expect him to be quite cheap, especially considering the year that VCARB had and the year that Red Bull as a whole had. So I do think Hadjar will be quite cheap. I do think he'll be around 6.2 million, which is where sort of Magnussen started last year, right? So I think 6.2 million is fair for Hadjar. Compared to Tsunoda, started last year at 8 million, ended at 11.9 million. I think Tsunoda will only get a slight bump. I do think he could receive a larger bump than this, just based on the performance of the car. But I think based on like the year that he had, and he was a solid option throughout the season, even though he might not have been worth that initial 8.0 million, and they weren't even close as dominant as we thought. I think 7.5 million feels fair. A slight bump down considering where they ended up, being the 8th fastest team and really in no man's land in that regard. So I do think Tsunoda, 7.5 million, slight drop-off seems fair for the 2025 season. All right, moving on to another rookie. Well, can we really call him a rookie after the year he just had? Oli Bearman, driving for Haas. Another difficult one to predict. He had a lot of different prices last year due to him starting off as a Ferrari substitute and then coming into Haas. And then Haas as a team is very, very difficult to predict considering the year they had last year. I mean, they were definitely underpriced. I mean, Hulkenberg was 6.4, Magnussen was 6.2 million at the start of the year. Both of them climbed well up into the 13 million pluses. The reason why I've written out that Alpines were at 7.8 million, and by that I mean both Ocon and Gasly started last year at 7.8 million, is that Alpine were the team that were sort of predicted to finish P7, where Haas ended up finishing. They obviously came into 2024 ahead of VCARB, but both the VCARBs were priced higher than the Alpines due to just we were expecting the hype around it. And I think that's what F1 Fantasy were doing. They were taking into account that a lot of people were expecting VCARB to be good and thus priced the VCARBs ahead of the Alpine. So I would say at the beginning of the 2024 season, the Alpines were expected to be the P6 team, or the P7 team. They ended up being P6, but that was just from their miraculous climb at the end of the season and their miraculous performance in Brazil. So for that reason, I'm going to use the Alpines as sort of a jump-off point from Bearman and then lower it slightly due to him being a rookie. But I do think they will not underestimate Haas this year. So I do think the Haas assets will be more appropriately priced, but then again, Bearman is a rookie, so I think he will be slightly lower than what the Alpines were. But I will say that this was one of the ones that I thought was the hardest one to predict, because I could definitely see them overpricing Bearman just due to his performances last year. So I could definitely see Bearman being as high as like 8.5 million, maybe even touching 9 million if they're really crazy. But I'm going to predict that he will come in at 7.5 million, still ahead of the other rookies in the back market cars, but not by much. Then we have Ocon. He was, as previously mentioned, 7.8 million at Alpine and ended the 2024 season way higher. He was the one that broke into the 15 millions out of all of the back markets, really, apart from like Lance Stroll briefly. I do think because he's moved to Haas, it's a bit different. It's a new car, new system. But I do think he will be higher priced than he was at Alpine just due to the season he was last year. And if he could do like a Magnussen type year, I think Ocon could be a fantastic asset to own, especially if he starts the game at 8.2 million. Because again, like Ocon did not have the best qualifying year last year in Alpine. And if he can find the same sort of, position in the game that Magnussen found last year with the Haas, sort of qualifying lower and then climbing a lot, being aggressive as Ocon is, getting penalties. I feel like Ocon could be the Kevin Magnussen replacement, and I do see him starting around the 8 to 9 million mark, but I'm going to put him slightly on the lower side at 8.2 million. And then moving on to Alpine, then, who finished ahead of Haas in the championship. Doohan is a rookie, right? And Doohan is a very, very special type of driver to predict, because of the reason that Franco Colapinto have been signed as his replacement pretty much already. I mean, Colapinto has a multi-year deal with Alpine, reportedly. There's no way there's no way that Franco Colapinto is sitting on the bench for all those 3 years of his contract, right? I think if Doohan does not get off and running, beating Gasly at the start of the year, he is going to get replaced sooner rather than later. Tough sport. I feel really bad for Doohan, but that's just the way it is. At least he gets to drive in his home race in Australia. As previously mentioned, Ocon and Gasly as well was 7.8 million. Doohan, when he joined the game at the end of last year for the one race he was in, was 11.1 million, ended 2024 at 10.9, or he ended at 10.7. I can't remember which one it was, but I think it says he ended the year at 10.9 million. That could have either been the price he came in at or the price he got after dropping 0.2 million in the final race after having a subpar performance. I think Doohan's going to be cheap. I know that Alpine have some improvements. They have been a faster team, but I still think they will price him low for the fact that, we're expecting him to get replaced already. For that reason, I think he's going to be quite cheap at 6.2 million, even though we're expecting Alpine to be relatively fast competing for points throughout the season. I think Doohan is going to come in at 6.2 million. He could be at around 6.4, but I'm gonna place my bet that he is actually the second cheapest asset in the game, pretty much, which would make him a really, really enticing option, because I don't think anyone would actually look at Doohan's way in terms of getting F1 fantasy points, considering he's definitely not rated within the community or obviously within Alpine itself, considering they've already signed his replacement. So I do think 6.2 million is fair. We'll see how they do with driver swaps this year in F1 Fantasy, if they keep doing the immediate switch, or if they give each new driver that come in their separate price, because I do think if Doohan gets replaced relatively quickly, I would expect them to give Colapinto a new price and not base it off of Doohan's price. But for the reasons I just stated, I think Doohan is going to be very cheap at 6.2 million. I do think if you're willing to take the risk, if he's not going to be a DNF risk of sorts, I think at 6.2 million he would be a fantastic option to round out your teams alongside Bortoleto and allow you to bring in some of those heavier hitters. Hello, Rain from the future here. This part of the recording got corrupted, so ignore the hair, face, and outfit change. Let's talk about Gasly. So Gasly, I think, is going to be slightly more expensive than Ocon at 8.4 million. Started last year 7.8, so it's actually an increase in price for him, which if you would have asked me like in October what I thought Gasly's price would be at the start of this year, I would have said lower than 7.8. But just because of the end of the season form that Gasly had, I think they will increase his price just based on like where we expect him and Alpine to be, right? If we go and compare him to Ocon specifically at 8.2 million, they started last year at the same price point, so I do think they will be priced similarly. And I guess we have to see like where Haas and Alpine fall together. I think there could be a good fight between those two teams. Gasly at 8.4 million is just enough. I think he probably doesn't really deserve an increase if we're fair, but I think just based on what he did at the end of last year, they will give him an increase. I wouldn't even be surprised, really, if they just slapped a 9 million price tag on him and said that he's the best of the rest driver on the grid, because he kind of was that at the end of last year. So I'm unsure with Gasly. I'm going to say that they slightly bump his price, that is slightly higher than Ocon, but still close enough to where it's not really a sizable difference. Back to Old Rain. Moving on to a very interesting driver, we have Lance Stroll. Now, Lance Stroll and also Fernando Alonso came into the game way higher than the other bottom 5 teams because of the 2023 season that they had. So at the start of 2024, both Stroll and Alonso were quite expensive. Stroll at 10.7 million. But I mean, at the start of 2023, the Aston Martin was like the second fastest car, right? So they had to price them high because they were so incorrectly priced at the start of the 2022 season. So therefore, they had to price them higher, and that ended up being a mistake because the Aston Martin was woeful, right? Stroll started at 10.7 million, had a decent start to the year, climbed up quite quickly up to above 15 million, which was the C and B tier split. I had him at the start of the season as well, and he was good for fantasy points. But since he hit that 15 million mark at sort of the mid-season, he had a woeful second half of the year, dropping over 1 million in price over the last half of the season. So for that reason, and also the Aston Martin's general performance, I think he's going to come into this year being much cheaper. I think he's going to come down to 8.5 million, actually being part of the back market group, the midfield group, if you will, and not be their sort of own case. I still think, as you'll see, I might as well move on to him right now, that Fernando Alonso is still going to be in a league of his own in terms of starting price, but he will also drop. I mean, Stroll did not have a good year, and I think Stroll will be at that 8.5 million, around that 8.5 to 9 million price point. Alonso, again, consistently outperformed the car, but in terms of F1 fantasy, he actually had the worst season, right? Not in terms of points, but in terms of budget gain, because Alonso started the year at 15.8 million and ended the year at 15.3. Over the course of the year, he actually dropped in price, which is unbelievable, frankly, considering how the price change algorithm works. But that was just the reason, right? He was above 15 million, meaning he was priced at a different category than the other drivers. But then again, I mean, Alonso consistently outperforms the car, and he was consistently among the points. I mean, there was a reason he was like best of the rest. Did Gasly pass him? I can't actually remember now if Gasly passed Alonso in the championship, but I do still think that Alonso in the Aston Martin, especially with Adrian Newey coming in, although we don't know how much Adrian Newey has worked on this year's car, presumably not at all, but he can work on the development for this car, I assume. Again, I don't actually know the ins and outs of how that deal works. I think Alonso will be in a category of his own, priced above the second highest among the back markers, which I predict to be Sainz, but still a ways below the 15.8 million or the 15 million drop off between the B and the C tier. So I do think that 12.5 million will be somewhat correct, and depending on what other where the other assets are priced, especially like the more expensive drivers, if you could fit an Alonso in there, especially at the start of the season for budget gains, I think Alonso could be really powerful in getting you to that 15 million mark quite quickly, and then you offload him and ignore him for the rest of the season. So if the price change algorithm works the same, I think Alonso could be a really good option depending on if you can fit in the other drivers that you want to at the start of the season. But 12.5 million is my prediction for Alonso. 8.5 million is my prediction for Lance Stroll. All right, let's move on to the big hitters, the top 4 teams, probably what you have been waiting for if you watched this entire video up until this point. And if you have, why not like the video, right? You've spent some time. I don't even know how long I've been recording for. So another rookie, the last rookie, I suppose, if you don't call Liam Lawson a rookie. I guess Liam Lawson is kind of a rookie, but I would say Antonelli is the final rookie we're going to talk about. And I'm going to compare him with Russell, right? Russell started the game last year as sort of the second driver at Mercedes behind Hamilton at 18.8 million. But Mercedes were also, over the course of the year, further behind the top 3 than we thought. So I do think that Mercedes, especially Hamilton, was slightly overpriced, at least at the beginning of last year. Mercedes definitely had their spells, they had their races where they were the better team, the team, or even the best team. But I do think they started slightly overpriced. And Russell, over the course of the season, you'll see on the next slide, didn't really gain that much in price. I mean, he was very unlucky with a few races, especially when he got disqualified. So I think Antonelli will definitely be above 15 million. You kind of have to put Antonelli above 15. If you put it below 15 million, if they were to put Antonelli at 14 million, you have to start the year with Antonelli. Like, you don't really have a choice. So I feel like you have to start him above 15 million. And I do think he'll be a bit below where Russell was at the start of last year. I think he'll be at around 16.8 million. The combination of, him being a rookie and also Mercedes being slightly off the pace compared to where we expected them. They really weren't in the mix with the top 3 teams. They were a sizable chunk of points behind. So I think 16.8 million, 2 million below where Russell was at the start of 2024, seems acceptable for Antonelli. Moving on to Russell then, starting at 18.8 million, ended the season at 23.2 million, could have been way higher if he wasn't so unlucky in a couple of races. I think due to him sort of rising in value, not in F1 fantasy, but like in the minds of people, right? At the beginning of the 2024 people, it was still clearly Hamilton's better than Russell, but Russell did consistently outperform Hamilton, especially in qualifying, and especially towards the end of the season. I mean, Hamilton wasn't even near Russell. You have to be able to admit that, even as a Lewis Hamilton stan. So I think for that reason, I think he will be slightly higher than what he was at the beginning of last year. Specifically, Hamilton was at 19.3 million. I think that's where they will put Russell to really cement that he is now the team leader. So I think Russell will start at 19.3 million, though I wouldn't be surprised if they put him at 18.8 million again. But I'm gonna predict that he gains a slight increase from where he started the year last year, and especially when you look at what kinds of points and what kinds of price rises he could have had he not had those unfortunate disqualifications and DNFs. I do think he would have been more in the conversation for a higher price point, but I still think he'll gain a price increase to 19.3 million. Moving on to the third place team in the Constructor Championship, and it's Liam Lawson. Very difficult to predict. Paris started the year 20.8 million. It was like the one driver in that echelon of prices that didn't reach the 25 million mark after the horrid season that Paris had. Now, we don't know how Lawson is going to perform here, but also with, you have to take Red Bull's downfall into consideration. Maybe Max Verstappen, I think Max Verstappen is just the GOAT. It's very possible that Red Bull had the fourth fastest car throughout the entire second half of the season, and Paris putting a P8 is like where the car was supposed to be. I do think Paris was also underperforming. We'll see where Lawson puts it. But I do think, considering he's sort of a pseudo-rookie in a way, also new to the team, and with how Checo performed last year, and where Red Bull was in the Constructor Championship, I do think he will be cheaper than where Paris started, like way cheaper, right? I put him at 17.5 million. I think he'll be cheaper than Russell. I think he'll be more expensive than Antonelli, which is important, but I don't think by much. I think Antonelli and Lawson will be those two that are sort of similarly priced, and I think if we go back, I put Antonelli 16.8, so I think within that 16.5 to 17.5 million range, I think that's where they'll put both Kimi Antonelli and Liam Lawson. So that's where I predict Lawson to be. I could be wrong, though. He could still be like 20 million. But I'm going to predict that they lower the price of Red Bull assets. And next up is the championship winner. I mean, he won the Drivers' Championship. They didn't win the Constructors. It's Max Verstappen. Started the year 30 million schmeckles, right? So expensive. Unbelievably expensive. And at the start of the year, I thought, when we expected Verstappen to go and win every race like he did in 2023, everyone was saying, including me, was saying he was essential, and then slowly but surely we started to realize he was really not, and that in fact those of us that started with Max Verstappen, although we got the early points of him, it ended up being a trap because you didn't gain any budget with him. Now they have to reduce his price this year. Red Bull is the third fastest car, perhaps even the fourth fastest car. We don't know what they've done over the winter break. Perhaps they're back. Perhaps they're going to be the fastest car starting this year again. We don't know. But they have to lower Max Verstappen's price. He really wasn't an asset at the end of the year, and no one could feasibly fit him in. Some people did with crazy budgets, but 30 million. He only ended up climbing to 32.3, which is still quite impressive considering the maximum he could gain in any single race was 32.3. Even with that, I'm predicting a quite steep drop-off in price down to 25.2 million. I still think you still have to put Max Verstappen in that A-tier category of drivers. I don't think you can put him as a B-tier driver below 25 million, because if you do, I think similarly to Kimi Antonelli below 15 million, if Max Verstappen is below 25 million, you kind of have to start with him just because of how good Max is. Gain the budget, and then once Max Verstappen has hit 25 million, then you could switch him to another B-tier driver in Ferrari or Mercedes or whatever. So I think you have to start Verstappen at 25.2 million. I'm still expecting him to be a P3 or above in every single race, but at least now he is an option. But you still have to make this conscious decision that I'm going to start the game with an A-tier driver, which I think will end up being incorrect if the budget system is the same as it was in 2024. Budget is so important. We saw it at the end of the season. So many people among the top leaderboard, if you look through the top 100 people, a lot of them managed to fit in 3 premium driver teams alongside 2 premium constructors, and most of us just was not in that price category at all, just due to how they played the game at the start of the season. Granted, I think it was mostly luck because we didn't know. No one knew how the price change algorithm worked at the start of last year. We do know that now. I have a video of that on my channel, by the way. So you can probably scroll back and look if you want to see how the price change algorithm worked in 2024. So 25.2 million is my prediction for Verstappen. Quite a low drop off, quite a big drop off, but still above that A tier 25 million mark, which I think is important for him. Moving on to Lewis Hamilton. I should have just put his Ferrari pictures that came out last week here, but nevertheless, here he is now at Ferrari. Crazy times we live in. Started at 19.3 at Mercedes last year. Was overpriced, really, considering that Sainz was 18.5, Leclerc was 19.1 million. And Hamilton ended up climbing and ended the year at 25.8 million, mainly due to his poor qualifying and being able to climb a lot in races and also having a couple of wins in there. I do think he'll be more expensive now that he is at Ferrari. The team is better. They kind of have to price him higher, even though I suspect Leclerc to still be better. I mean, Hamilton is going into this team. He has to perform. He was not that good in qualifying last year. We don't know where he's going to be. But if Hamilton has a similar year to last year, where he is worse in qualifying, but now he has a better car with better race pace than the Mercedes, I mean, who knows how high he could go. You know, think of like Lewis last year. The reason why he gained so many points and climbed up to 25.8 million was those poor qualifying performances. And if he's going to continue being worse in qualifying, especially considered to the qualifying expert in Leclerc, you have Russell, you have a lot of very strong qualifiers in the field. Norris is a really strong qualifier. Max is a really, really strong qualifier as well. So with all these really good qualifying drivers, I mean, where do you put Hamilton in that? I think you would expect Hamilton to not be above like a P5 if you just were to just base it on what we've seen, what kind of performances we've seen, especially if McLaren are really, really strong at the start of the season that a lot of people are predicting. You know, Piastri will be up there as well. Then you have Kimi Antonelli. How good will he be in qualifying? You don't know Lawson. So really, since those are unknowns, and if you still want to put it as the top four teams, you're expecting Hamilton to probably start the season being P6 in qualifying around that point. But then if he has a better car, a better race pace car in the Ferrari over the Mercedes, I mean, the joke last year was Russell and Hamilton start with 5 cars in between them and they end up next to each other. That was the entirety of last season. Imagine then what Hamilton could do in a Ferrari that is rumored to be way better in terms of race pace than the Mercedes, at least on a more consistent basis. And considering how much Hamilton complained about the car last year, if the car is just more consistent, I do think he can very much outperform it. I think he'll be more expensive than he was at the start of last year. I think they will sort of realize, at least, when I say they, I mean F1 Fantasy, that Ferrari could take the constructors this year. They are definitely favorites for P2, and therefore I think he'll be at 20.4 million. And as for his new teammate Leclerc, he started last year at 19.1 million, was definitely underpriced, I thought. Ended 2024 at the sky high of 26.1 million. I think they're going to price Leclerc and Hamilton equally. You have Leclerc, who's been at the team for a longer time. You have Hamilton, who is the GOAT. Hamilton is new to the team, coming in there, being worse at qualifying. It makes it a really, really difficult pick if you can only pick one of the two, right? Because on one hand, Leclerc, you know what you will get with Leclerc. He is going to be up there in qualifying. He can get wins. He is a really, really good driver. He is the future of Ferrari still. I mean, he's still quite young. And he had a really, really good, really, really consistent year last year. I mean, he was constantly P3, P2, P1 for no reason, right? He only won 3 times, but he was still consistently up there, P2, P3. Had very, very few bad performances last year, and the few bad performances that he did have wasn't really his fault either. I think he will definitely gain a price increase, but with Hamilton coming in there, I really don't see them pricing them differently. They kind of have to put them equally, because if they price one higher than the other, I feel like you're kind of forced to go with the other and just hope that goes your way. Whichever I prefer, it's really, really difficult to say, because obviously Hamilton has a new car that he has to adapt to, and we don't know how well he's going to do that. But he also has the advantage of being the worst qualifying, meaning he can gain more overtakes in the race. And I mean, Lewis Hamilton is just a different beast in Formula 1. Like, the other people or the other drivers on the grid are Formula 1 drivers. Lewis Hamilton is a phenomenon. And I do think, especially now in Ferrari, and especially if he have if he starts P6, climbs to a podium in his first race in Australia, I mean, you could definitely see that happening. If I told you right now that, only Lawson, out of the top 4 teams, you have 8 drivers, Lawson and Kimi are behind Hamilton, right, because they're rookies, but all the other drivers outperform Hamilton in qualifying. Hamilton starts the Australian Grand Prix in P6. You would say, yeah, that makes total sense. I could definitely see that happening. And then one person DNFs because it's the first race of the season. It's Australia. Something crazy is going to happen. And then Hamilton overtakes twice and ends up getting P3. Who is getting driver of the day, right? It's going to be Hamilton. So for that reason, I do think that Hamilton, in the scenario where Hamilton and Leclerc are the same price, I think Hamilton will be the better option. But just barely. It's very, very difficult to forego Leclerc. And when you did that last year, you definitely got punished. But it's a close one, but I do think they have to put them at the same price. Moving on then to the final team on the grid, we have the champions, the Constructors Champion of 2024 and the predicted Constructors Champions and maybe even Driver Champion of 2025. We have McLaren, right? Let's start with Piastri. Started the season at 19 million, below many of the, below Hamilton, below Leclerc, below Checo, but ended at 25.7, so had a really, really good year and a good climb. I do think Piastri, considering he got outperformed, was it 20-4 in qualifying compared to Lando? Although he had his performances, he had his 2 wins, he really didn't bring it to Lando as much as we would have thought, right? It was more Lando bringing it down a few times. And at the start of last year, I sort of predicted that Piastri would really come for the title of team leader, but that was not really ever on the cards. I mean, we saw the papaya rule sort of bite McLaren in the mid portion of the season, and then when it actually looked like McLaren or Norris was in for the driver's title, they immediately demoted Piastri to second fiddle, and then brought him back, and Lando gave him a sprint win at the end of the year, since Piastri gave Lando one earlier. So for that reason, I think he will be similarly priced to the Mercedes assets, but I do think he'll be slightly below. Now, I do realize that like 20 million compared to Verstappen's 25 million is a big drop-off, but I mean, that's what you get. Like, it's Max Verstappen, and you'll see where I've priced Norris. I do think these will be like our B-tier drivers that we will be talking about. We'll have Kimi and Lawson is in a sort of similar price category, and then we will have Russell, Hamilton, Leclerc, and Piastri in one category, sort of similarly priced, where with Russell slightly below the rest, similar to last year. And then we will have Lando Norris and Max Verstappen at the top. Lando Norris started last year 23 million, was really in a league of his own, way above the third highest, which was Checo at 20.8 million, but also way, way below Max Verstappen at 30 million. I think this year, considering how the cars performed at the end of the year, although Max Verstappen is insane and definitely the best driver on the grid currently, outperforming that horrid Red Bull car. I say horrid, but very, very difficult car to manage in that Red Bull. I do think they will price Norris over Max Verstappen this year. Norris, since the McLaren upgrades in Miami, was almost must have the rest of the year, and when you went without him, you got very much punished. I went without him for like one race when Piastri had a couple of good ones in a row, and I was expecting Piastri to be up there, only for it being Zandvoort, and Norris had his biggest haul of the season. Yes, I know that Norris choked a couple of wins. He was bad on lap 1. He's still a really, really good qualifier. He consistently put it at P1, P2 over the course of the year. He outperformed Piastri like 20-4 or 19-5 over the course of the season in qualifying. And I do think he'll keep picking up wins this year, and he will be the favorite to win the Drivers' Championship in 2025 if that McLaren continues to perform the way it did last year. Now, I do think people were slightly overplaying the dominance of the McLaren car. They did end up winning, but I do think it was still sort of track dependent, and you could really see that, especially like in Brazil, that they did slightly lose. They did lose a lot of power depending on the setup. So I don't think, people are talking about, there's always a dominant car, and Norris should have won. Norris bottled the entire thing. yes, he did bottle a few races, but the gap still ended up being big enough that I don't think it would have ended up mattering. And also, I don't think the McLaren is anywhere near as dominant as people say it is. It's not near as dominant as the Red Bull was in 2023. I still think over the course of the year it was the better car, and lo and behold, it did up winning the Constructors' Championship. I think it was way too close between them and Ferrari. I think Ferrari should not have been in on a shot, and I think that's sort of where the bottling came in, that those few performances that they had over the course of the season that ended up, with the team losing a couple of points, made it so that Ferrari were slightly closer than they perhaps should have been. But I still think McLaren are going to be the favorites to win the entire thing going in this year, and I think Norris is still the clear team leader within the team, and I think he needs to be priced above Max Verstappen to start the year. I've predicted 26 million. It could be something like 25.8 or 25.7 with like a 0.5 increase above Max Verstappen. They could even end up pricing Norris and Verstappen the exact same to really drive home the point that, it's going to be between these two drivers over the course of the season. So that's all my drivers' predictions. Let's move on to the constructor predictions and see how they differ. So here we have the constructors, and the constructors last year, I think, suffered from a pretty big problem. On the upper end, they were kind of must-haves, right? You'll see that when we get to it, but the constructors among the top 4 teams were severely underpriced, in my opinion. Meanwhile, on the lower end, the worst constructors were nowhere near good enough, right? They were way overpriced considering what they were. And the reason for this is like you get so many points from the constructors that it was almost never worth going with the C tier constructor, even if they were super cheap, because you could just get so much more from the good constructors, and the good constructors were the same price as the good drivers. And that was the problem, right? Because why would you ever go with Kick Sauber? You wouldn't go with Kick Sauber anyway, but why would you go with Kick Sauber plus Leclerc when you could go with Ferrari and Bottas? Because from Ferrari, you got both Leclerc's points and Sainz's points and the team's points, because Leclerc and Ferrari were priced similarly. And I think that was the big mistake they made. So going into these predictions now, assuming everything stays the same about the game, I have severely changed the pricing compared to the top 4 teams and the bottom 6 teams, and you'll see what I mean by that. So first up, Sauber. Sauber started the season last year at 6.6 million. The cheapest last year was both Haas and Williams, starting at 6.3. I think Sauber has to start lower than both of them, considering how bad they were last year. 5.8 million seems fair. You can't really price it much lower than that. That's still a really, really cheap price for a constructor. But I'm not expecting the constructor to get that many points. And even at 5.8 million, I would advise you to go against it and not own the Sauber. But, 5.8 million seems fine. It's way cheaper than what Hulkenberg is. But then again, you got to predict something. And I don't think you can put Sauber. Maybe they have 6 million as sort of the lowest it can go. But I think 5.8 million is fair for Sauber. Then we have Williams. Williams started last year at 6.3 million and then ended actually at 6.1 million. That's how horrid of a time Williams had last year with all of their DNFs. I think even though we're sort of expecting Williams to, at least be slightly better this year, and you can't expect them to DNF as much as they did last year, I still think they should be lowered in price, down to 6 million. So Williams, 6 million. And VCARB then at 6.8 million. Started last year at 8.5, but was very, very overpriced. Everyone was expecting them to be clearly 6th fastest. They weren't. At 6.8 million, they're slightly more expensive than what Sauber was last year. If you remember, Sauber started last year at 6.6 million, and they were sort of expected, at least coming into 2024, to be 8th fastest, right? So it's still an uptick in value to VCARB, but I don't think they will go lower with VCARB, considering they were 8.5 million last year, even though, they had a good rise up to 12.9 million. So I would, if I were to set the prices, I would put VCARB down at maybe 6 million as well, close to Williams, but I don't think they will do that. And if you note, like, Williams at 6 million is way cheaper than both Albon and Sainz. I put Sainz at 9.5 million something, and Albon at 7. So I think Williams will be way lower and could actually, like, if C-tier strategies come out and are viable, maybe Williams could be one of those viable cars. But they have to do something to make the C-tier constructors viable, and I think this is the way to do it. Then VCARB, I put the question mark there because I don't know what they're called anymore. They apparently changed the name again. Are they just Racing Bulls now? I don't know. I don't care. I'm going to call them VCARB until next year. 6.8 million is where I predict they will end up. Then we have Haas. Haas started the year at 6.3 million, and this is the one C-tier I predicted to go up. I mean, it has to go up. It has to be higher. 7.4 million seems fair. I mean, if you compare that to where VCARB was at 8.5 and where Alpine was at 8.4 million, it's still a drop-off in price from the 6th and 7th fastest team. So 7.4 million seems fair for a starting point for Haas. They also climbed really high to 12.2 million last year. And then with Alpine, they started last year at 8.4 million. I still think they should come down in price, down to 7.7 million, meaning that, you know, where we expect the 6th fastest team to be is still a drop off in price quite drastically from the 8.5 where it was before, down to 7.7 million. Compare that to the drivers that I predicted. You know, I put Hadjar. I put Doohan quite a bit lower than this, but this is roughly where I priced Gasly, so it seems fair as a price for Alpine. Just a slight difference from Haas compared to, you know, what, and that is to account for what Alpine did at the end of last year and where we expect them to be this year, especially with Gasly. So 7.7, 7.4, these are interchangeable. I think they could end up being the same price, but we'll see where that is. But I do think they do need to be lowered to make C-tier constructors viable and enticing to buy and differentiate your strategy with. Then we have Aston Martin. Aston Martin last year had a wild ride. It was a proper roller coaster. Started the year 13.6 million. And at the start of the year, when they were like the clear 5th fastest team, it was actually a strategy I recommended to buy Aston Martin before they hit 15 million because they were rising in price early in the season. I got in on Aston Martin, rode it up to 15 million, and then sold them off. They ended up rising after they hit 15 million to like 15.6, and then their late season form kicked in and they dropped down below back into the C tier again. So a real roller coaster ride. I think Aston Martin has to be way lower this year to even make it a strategy at all. Like, the reason Aston Martin was a strategy last year was because it looked like they were the 5th fastest team early on. And in that case, yes, you know, once they were below 15 million, or when they were below 15 million, they were an option. But as soon as they hit that 15 million mark, they were never an option again. They were like the worst team you could possibly pick. And then on top of that, even when they dropped back down to a C tier, it was like, oh, maybe we buy them now. They were just so bad. Like, they weren't even close to the 5th fastest team, as Alpine and Haas consistently took those places, and sometimes a cheeky Colapinto or an Alex Albon, right? So, or Yuki Tsunoda. So for that reason, Aston Martin has to come down in price. I do think they will start, and they should start higher, and quite a bit higher than where Haas and Alpine are. I think 10 million is probably fair. It's above Stroll, but it's still 2.5 million below Alonso. And maybe then Aston Martin could actually be an option for us to start the year. So I think 10 million is where I would price Aston Martin at. And now we're about to see a quite big jump up in price, right? Mercedes, 22.3 million. And I think this is still way too low. If I were to price this, I would put Mercedes at 25 million. Bump, like straight at 25 million. And the reason for this is that these B tier or A tier constructors at their price point at the start of last year were way too good. The only strategy that was correct from the start of the year, objectively, was running Ferrari plus Mercedes, and then as soon as McLaren got good with their Miami performance, it was McLaren plus 1, right? And then it shifted which one was better. Sometimes Ferrari had a howler, sometimes Mercedes had a howler, but that was the correct choice every single time. Red Bull ended up not being in the conversation at all, just because at the start of the year they were the only constructor that was an A-tier asset. So if you started with Red Bull, you had a really, really bad time. I mean, you got some points early, but then you just fell off a cliff in terms of budget gains. And it was just these B-tier, Mercedes, McLaren, and Ferrari last year were way, way too good. And I think 22.3 million is still a 2.3 million uptick from where they started last year. I still think that's way too low. But that's where I predict they will put them, just because there was that gap between 4th and 3rd. I don't think they will make Mercedes an A-tier asset. And I think Mercedes starting at 22.3 million will be an auto include in every team if they don't put it at 25 million. I don't think they'll put it at 25 million because they only ended up climbing to 25.1, right? But I just, with Mercedes, even if they end up being the fourth fastest team and Red Bull are better, 22.3 million, they will be the B tier asset to pick from, because as you'll see with my predictions, if my predictions come through, the rest of the constructors are all A tiers, starting off at A tiers, and I think that's where they should be. I think Mercedes should be up there as well, or else they will be auto includes. But I do think, like, if these predictions come through, I do think Mercedes will be like the auto pick, and that you either go for an A tier constructor to go alongside that, or you go for a budget building route and actually pick a C tier constructor to start the year, and pick maybe multiple of the B tier drivers. You maybe pick like Leclerc and Hamilton, and a Kimi Antonelli, plus like a Mercedes and an Aston Martin, or a Mercedes and a Haas, or a Mercedes and an Alpine to gain budget early on. And like that's where I could see a C tier constructor working. The C tier constructors, I will say this right now, the only way a C tier constructor strategy will work is if at least 3 of the 4 top teams start the season as A tiers. I've only placed Mercedes below 25 million. If any of the others as well start below 25 million, the start of the season, the team to go for will be the two big constructors that start below 25 million plus anything else, because you will ride those until they hit 25 million, and then if you still need budget building and you think budget building is the way to go, then maybe you can go down to the C tiers and start, shopping and see if there's any standout options. As I've predicted it, I do still think there could be strategies where both like Mercedes plus a McLaren, or a Mercedes plus something like an Alpine Haas could work. And I think without changing anything else of the game, adding any scoring systems, changing any scoring systems, the only way to make the C tier constructors actually good is to increase the prices of the A tier constructors. And that's what I've predicted. Now, granted, this is very much my wish. I think Mercedes should be 25 million as well. But my prediction is that they'll actually go through with this. Red Bull then, 25.4 million, 2.2 million more than Max Verstappen. If they, even if Red Bull, we take them as the third fastest team, if they put Red Bull, started the season at 24 million, you have to start the season with Red Bull, because they have Max Verstappen, they're gonna be good, you just need Liam Lawson to not be worse than Checo, and then they will climb up to 25 million, and you will gain that budget very, very quickly. I think Red Bull has to be above 25 million. They started last year 27.9 million, so it's still a big drop off in price for Red Bull. But I feel like that's justified considering the season that they had. Then my Ferrari prediction is that they are way above that at 26.2 million, way higher than both Lewis Hamilton and Leclerc. And I feel like this is needed, right? Because if Ferrari also start at 20.4 million, why would you ever pick Lewis Hamilton or Leclerc? You just pick Ferrari, and then you pick whichever driver you want to 2x. So again, which could still be a Leclerc or a Hamilton, but Ferrari has to be above 25 million for sure. I think Red Bull, just by proxy of Ferrari and McLaren being above 25 million, has to be above 25 million. That's where I think Mercedes, I don't think Mercedes, in an ideal world where the price change system worked differently, I do think you could price. I do think that the gap between Mercedes and Red Bull here in price is fair. It's just the problem that Mercedes will rise so much quicker in price that's why they kind of become auto includes, if you understand me. But I feel like if Mercedes is 25 million and Red Bull's 25.4, you never pick Mercedes, you just pick Red Bull instead. So for that reason, I think it's okay to have one of the top 4 actually be a B tier asset. But again, if more than one of the top 4 teams are B tier assets, that will be the strategy at the start of the season, 100%. Because that's what objectively was the correct call last year. The correct call was to go for Mercedes plus Ferrari at the start of the season, and then switch either of them to McLaren once McLaren got good, because they were all below 25 million. Once they hit 25 million, you could start switching up slightly. And I feel like that could be the same this year if they do end up being below 25. I've rambled on too long about this. Ferrari 26.2 million, McLaren slightly above at 26.5. This gap could be bigger, and the gap between them could be different. I could put Red Bull at 25.2, similar to Max, or even just flat out 25 million, and then Ferrari at 26 million, and McLaren at 27. The actual difference between them is not that big. I think the main prediction for me is that I do think they will place them all above 25 million. It is also my hope, because in this case, like, imagine the strategies that we could start creating, right? It would be it would be a much more interesting start to the season, because if these were the prices, I could definitely see a team of something like Mercedes plus C tier being good, or Mercedes plus A tier being good if you're going for the points. So very, very interesting. I think this would create a good starting base for the season. Sure, you could go for the big point scores in McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull immediately, but you wouldn't gain that all-important budget that you can then use at the end of the season. And I mean, that's where you could really start getting into the strategy of the game, and I mean, that's what we all love, right? And then to end the video, I thought I would make 2 team examples based on the predictions I've made, what type of teams you could make with the budgets or with the prices that I have predicted. So let's first take the example of the A-tier points chaser. This is referring to, of course, the constructors. So this team right here will be worth, at the start of the season, if all of my price predictions are correct, which they won't be, would be worth 99.9 million. You would start with a big A-tier constructor like McLaren, assuming they are going to dominate. You pick Mercedes because they're going to get a lot of points and still gain you some budgets. You then have to pick one A-tier driver, and considering you're running one Mercedes and one McLaren, I feel like you're splitting yourself too much by going for a Ferrari driver here in like Leclerc or Hamilton. And you definitely cannot afford to go for someone like a Norris with this team structure. You maybe could go for Norris and then like super downgrade Alonso, because I've still picked the most expensive C-tier driver in here. So you could pick a team which has like instead of Alonso, you pick someone like a Hadjar, another rookie, and then you go for Norris. I mean, that's probably the biggest A-tier points chaser, right? But here I've gone for Piastri because it's still a B-tier. He will still give you some budget, so it's not all the way in the A-tier points chaser territory. But if you want to go there, I say you probably go for Norris, and instead of going for Piastri plus Alonso, you probably go for something like Piastri, or you probably go for something like Norris plus Hadjar, which is a switch you could afford within this budget. Then you have the 7 million Albon, which I think is a quite good price for him, despite his woeful end to last season. And then you kind of have to just go for the cheapest, or else you're not going to afford it. Doohan and Hadjar are the same price at 6.2, so you could chase them between, but I think Doohan is the better option at 6.2 million. And if they bring in Franco Colapinto and keep Doohan's price, I think Franco Colapinto will be better than what Hadjar is. And then Bortoleto, being the cheapest asset, is just in there because that's what you can afford. But that's kind of the corners that you have to cut if you're going to go for a big A-tier constructor when they are all priced at such a high cost. And then we have the second one, which is the C-tier budget chaser type build. Here I've gone for Mercedes because that's the B-tier constructor of choice, and then you could go for either Haas or Alpine. I just put Haas in there for now. I think those two are probably the most attractive ones. And you can see the type of team you can build, and you can slot in double Ferrari. I think in this case it's actually okay to go for Ferrari assets even though you don't have the Ferrari constructor. I've slotted in both Ferrari drivers because I'm a Ferrari fan, and they're B-tier drivers. You're gonna get budget from that. You completely ignore Norris, and you ignore all A tiers basically to just try and gain budget. You have Alonso in there, hoping that he can bring out those P8s, P9s, P10s, especially as the likes of Kimi Antonelli and Lawson find their footing a bit. Hoping that Adrian Newey cooked a bit and Aston Martin come out of the gate swinging, as Aston Martin have been over the course of the last 2 seasons. They have started the seasons quite well. We got to remember that, and hopefully they can do that this year if you go for this sort of team. You could, of course, instead of Haas, go for the Aston Martin constructor at 10 million, but then you would have to downgrade probably Ocon here. Since I've gone for Haas here, I've decided to go for Ocon as sort of an more expensive C-tier asset that I can hope can bring in a lot of points at 8.2 million or 8.4 million, whatever I put Ocon at. I expect him to gain a lot of position, similarly to last year in the Alpine, being slightly worse in qualifying and then climbing the race, a Magnussen type driver. And then, of course, I think Alex Albon at 7 million is quite a good option still. So Alex Albon is in there at 7 million. Again, you can upgrade a few of these. You still have 98.2 million, so you have budget in the bank if you want to move to other drivers. You can, of course, fit any of the Mercedes assets in there if you want to, double up with both Mercedes, the constructor, and have an Antonelli, or probably a Russell in there for his price. So these two teams, like, on they're very, very different. You know, I've put Alonso in here on both of them, but likely if you're going full points chaser, you're likely ignoring Alonso and doing Norris plus a Hadjar here, right? But these teams are very, very different. And in construction, I do expect this team would actually gain more points in the beginning. But again, you're chasing points here. Here you're chasing those budget gains with a C-tier constructor at the start of the season, which is very, very interesting. And really, it wasn't an option last year. And I just want the C-tier constructors to be an option. And that's sort of why I've constructed the video and my predictions in the way I have. And I really hope that's how F1 Fantasy price their assets in this year. And I think the main thing for making C-tier constructors good, really the only thing they have to do is make those top 4 teams more expensive. So that's some examples. I hope you enjoyed this video. That's it for my predictions. Let me know what's wrong. What did I mess up on? Which driver do you definitely not agree with? What was the worst prediction I made? What was my best prediction? What do you agree with? Do you agree with the thing that I said about C-tier and A-tier constructors? Because that's sort of the main thing I kind of wanted to get out with this video, that I really, really want the A-tier constructors to be super expensive. So you actually have to make a choice at the start of the season. Give me your predictions down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. Like it if you haven't already. Subscribe. A lot more things are coming to the channel over the course of the next 2 months before the season starts up again in the middle of March. I cannot wait for it. I'll see you in Australia, because I will be in Australia for the Melbourne Grand Prix. So if you're there, let me know and come say hi. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, whenever that is. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Goodbye.